The sight of blood on a man's shirt was nothing new in Placitas, New Mexico territory. But when the tall cowboy collapsed against the doorframe of the small adobe house on the edge of town in the summer of 1878, Martha Zimmerman knew her ordinary Tuesday afternoon was about to become anything but ordinary. "Mama, stay inside," Martha called over her shoulder as she rushed toward the stranger, her wet hands still dripping from the laundry tub. The man's hat had fallen into the dust, revealing dark hair matted with sweat and a face weathered by sun and hardship. His eyes, a striking shade of green even through the pain clouding them, fixed on her as she approached. "Madam, I apologize for the intrusion," he managed, his voice rough but polite despite his obvious distress. "I was told you might have a room I can pay." Martha assessed him quickly. The wound on his side was bleeding but not profusely, and his manner, even in pain, spoke of a man raised with manners. Still, caution was necessary. "You need a doctor, not a room." "Already saw him. He stitched me up, gave me laudanum, and said I needed rest. Said you might take in boarders." The cowboy grimaced, pressing his hand harder against his side where Martha could now see the clean white bandage peeking through his torn shirt. "Name's Thomas Bailey. I work for the Diamond Ranch, 20 miles south. Got caught in some trouble with rustlers 2 days back." "Martha," she replied, still hesitant. Behind her, she heard the shuffle of her mother's feet despite her warning. Catherine Zimmerman appeared in the doorway, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, her face lined with the years but her eyes still sharp. "For heaven's sake, Martha, help the man inside before he bleeds all over our doorstep," Catherine said with the authority only a mother could command. "We cannot have people dying in our yard. What would the neighbors think?" Despite the severity of the situation, Thomas Bailey's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. Martha made her decision and moved to his uninjured side, slipping her arm around his waist to support him. He was tall, well over 6 feet and solidly built, making the task challenging for her smaller frame. "I have money," Thomas repeated as they made slow progress into the small house. "I would not impose on your charity." "We will discuss payment when you are not about to collapse," Martha said firmly, guiding him toward the small room off the kitchen that had once been her father's study. Since his death 3 years ago, the room had sat mostly empty except for storage. "Mama, fetch clean water and linens." The room was sparse, containing only an old desk, a chair, and boxes of her father's belongings she had never quite managed to sort through. "We do not have a proper bed in here," Martha said apologetically. "I have slept on harder ground than this floor," Thomas replied, but before Martha could protest, Catherine appeared with an armful of quilts. "Martha, help me. We will make a proper pallet," her mother instructed, and together they quickly arranged a makeshift bed. Thomas lowered himself onto it with a groan that he tried unsuccessfully to suppress. "The doctor said you stitched him?" Martha asked, kneeling beside the pallet to examine the bandage more closely. "Yes, madam. Said I was lucky. The bullet went clean through, missed anything vital. Just need to rest and let it heal." Thomas reached into his vest pocket with his good arm and pulled out several coins. "This should cover a week's room and board if you are willing." Martha looked at the money, then at her mother. They needed it desperately. Taking in laundry barely covered their expenses, and her mother's health had been declining, requiring medicine they could scarcely afford. Yet something about accepting money from a wounded stranger felt wrong, even as her practical nature recognized the necessity. "Take it, Martha," Catherine said softly, reading her daughter's hesitation. "The man needs care and we need the income. It is a fair arrangement." "1 week then," Martha agreed, taking the coins. "I will bring you soup and fresh water. You need to keep your strength up to heal properly." "Thank you, madam." "Madams," Thomas corrected, nodding to both of them. "I am truly grateful." Martha returned to her abandoned laundry, but her mind remained on the stranger in their house. She knew nothing about Thomas Bailey beyond what he had told them, and trust was not something easily given in the New Mexico territory, where violence and lawlessness were common companions to daily life. Yet something about his manner, the respectful way he spoke despite his pain, and the genuine gratitude in his eyes made her think perhaps this arrangement might work. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Martha scrubbed shirts and trousers in the large wooden tub behind the house. She took in laundry from several families in town, along with the occasional traveler passing through who needed his clothes cleaned. It was hard work that left her hands raw and her back aching, but it was honest work, and it had kept her and her mother fed since her father's death. Catherine had been a teacher before age and failing health had forced her retirement. Now, at 62, she struggled with joint pain and a persistent cough that worried Martha constantly. The medicines Dr. Harrison prescribed helped, but they were expensive, and Martha often found herself choosing between her mother's medicine and other necessities. When Martha brought soup to Thomas Bailey that evening, she found him propped against the wall, his color better than it had been that afternoon. He attempted to rise when she entered, but she waved him back down. "Rest, Mr. Bailey." "You will tear your stitches," she said, setting the tray beside him. The soup was simple, made from beans and the vegetables from their small garden, but it was hot and nourishing. "Please call me Thomas," he said, accepting the bowl gratefully. "Mr. Bailey was my father's name, and it makes me feel about 20 years older than I am." "How old are you then?" Martha asked before she could stop herself, then felt her cheeks warm at the personal question. Thomas did not seem offended. "26, madam." "And yourself, if it is not impolite to ask?" "23, Martha replied. "And you may call me Martha. Madam makes me sound like a school teacher." "Your mother was one, I gather," Thomas said between careful spoonfuls of soup. "How did you know?" "The books," he gestured toward the boxes with his spoon, "and the way she carries herself. My mother was a teacher too, back in Virginia before we moved west." "Is she still there?" "Your mother?" Martha asked, settling into the chair since it seemed Thomas wanted conversation. A shadow passed over his face. "She died 2 years ago. Fever took her. My father passed when I was 15, so it was just the two of us for a long time." "I am sorry," Martha said softly, understanding the weight of that loss. "My father died 3 years ago, accident at the mill." "So we are both orphans in a way," Thomas said quietly. "Though I suppose you still have your mother." "For which I am grateful every day," Martha replied, standing. "I should let you rest. Call out if you need anything. I will be in the kitchen." Over the next few days, a routine established itself. Martha would check on Thomas each morning, bringing him breakfast and fresh water. Her mother, despite her own ailments, insisted on sitting with him for an hour each afternoon, claiming it was good to have conversation with someone new. Martha suspected her mother was lonely, and Thomas seemed to genuinely enjoy their talks. Martha continued her laundry work, her days filled with the endless cycle of washing, hanging, ironing, and folding. But she found herself looking forward to the times she brought Thomas his meals, when they would talk about small things that somehow felt significant. He told her about growing up in Virginia, about learning to be a cowboy in his teens after his father died, about the vast sky and endless spaces of the New Mexico territory that had captured his heart. In turn, Martha found herself sharing things she rarely spoke about. How she had once dreamed of being an artist, of painting the desert landscapes that surrounded their town. How her father's death had ended those dreams, replacing them with the practical necessity of survival. how she worried constantly about her mother's health and their financial situation. "You could still paint," Thomas said one evening as Martha collected his empty dinner plate. He had been with them 5 days now and was moving around more, though still carefully. "With what time?" Martha asked, not unkindly. "I work from dawn until well after dark most days. And even if I had time, paint and canvas cost money we do not have." "What if you had help with the laundry?" Thomas asked suddenly. "I could help. I know it is not proper work for a man, but I am stronger than you, and I could at least haul water and hang the heavy items." Martha stared at him. "You are still healing, and you are paying us to care for you, not to work." "I am nearly healed," Thomas protested, "and I am going mad lying here while you work yourself to exhaustion. The doctor said I need another week before I can ride, and I have money to pay you for that week too. But let me help, please." There was something earnest in his plea that touched Martha's heart. She realized he was not offering out of pity but out of genuine desire to be useful, to not feel like a burden. She understood that pride well. "If you promise to rest if you feel any pain," Martha finally said. "The last thing we need is for you to reopen that wound." Thomas's smile was bright enough to rival the New Mexico sun. "I promise." The next morning, true to his word, Thomas appeared in the yard behind the house. He moved slowly, favoring his injured side, but he was steady on his feet. Martha had already begun heating water over the fire, preparing for the day's work. "What can I do?" Thomas asked. Martha hesitated, then pointed to the large buckets. "Fill those from the well and bring them here. But lift with your legs, not your back, and nothing that strains your side." Working together transformed the nature of the work. What usually took Martha hours of backbreaking labor went faster with Thomas hauling water and hanging the heavier items like blankets and men's trousers. They fell into an easy rhythm, and Martha found herself humming while she worked, something she had not done in longer than she could remember. Catherine watched from the kitchen window, a knowing smile on her face. When Martha came in for lunch, her mother was brewing tea with an expression that Martha recognized all too well. "He is a good man," Catherine said without preamble. "Mama," Martha warned, "I am just saying. A good, kind man who works hard and treats people with respect. Those are not easy to find. He is a boarder. He will be gone in a few days," Martha replied, trying to ignore the small pang that thought caused. "Will he?" Catherine asked mildly. "He asked me this morning about whether we would consider keeping him on as a regular boarder. Said his work keeps him in this area frequently, and it would be convenient to have a place to stay rather than camping or staying at the boarding house in town." Martha's heart did an unexpected skip. "What did you tell him?" "That it was your decision as much as mine." "But I told him I would be amenable to it." Catherine poured tea into 2 cups. "We could use the steady income, Martha, and the help, and the company." "You like him," Martha accused gently. "I do," Catherine admitted. "He reminds me of your father in some ways. That same quiet strength, that kindness. Your father would have liked him too." Martha took her tea out to the small covered porch where Thomas was resting in the shade, drinking water from the dipper. He looked up as she approached, and she noticed again how green his eyes were, like spring grass after rain. "My mother said you asked about staying on permanently," Martha said, deciding directness was best. "I did," Thomas confirmed, "if it would not be an imposition. I would pay fair rate, and I could help with work around the place when I am here. Repairs, heavy lifting, whatever you need." "Why?" Martha asked. "The boarding house in town would be easier, closer to the saloon and the general store." Thomas was quiet for a moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I like it here. It is peaceful. Your mother is wonderful company, and you," he paused, color rising slightly in his tanned cheeks, "you are easy to talk to. I have not had that in a long time." A place that feels like a home instead of just somewhere to sleep. Martha's breath caught at the vulnerability in his admission. "We would be glad to have you," she heard herself say. "It would help us tremendously, and Mama does enjoy your company." "And you?" Thomas asked quietly. "Would you enjoy my company?" Martha met his eyes and found she could not look away. "Yes," she said simply. "I would." The smile he gave her was worth more than all the coins he had paid them. True to his word, Thomas became a fixture in their small household. His work with the Diamond Ranch kept him away for days at a time, but he always returned, and when he was there, he made himself indispensable. He repaired the leaking roof, fixed the broken gate, and built a better frame for hanging laundry that saved Martha's back considerable strain. In the evenings, he would sit with Catherine, discussing books and politics and philosophy, giving the older woman the intellectual stimulation she had missed since retiring from teaching. And with Martha, he simply existed in a way that felt both comfortable and electric. They would work side by side during the day, their conversations ranging from profound to silly. And in the evenings, after Catherine had gone to bed, they would sometimes sit on the porch together, watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky. One such evening, about 3 weeks after Thomas had first collapsed against their doorframe, Martha found herself studying his profile in the moonlight. He had been quiet tonight, something weighing on his mind. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. Thomas turned to look at her, his expression serious. "How strange life is. A month ago, I took a bullet in a fight that was not really mine. I was just in the wrong place, trying to help the ranch owner's son who had gotten mixed up with the wrong people. I thought I might die out there in the desert. And now here I am, in the first place that has felt like home since my mother passed, talking to a woman who makes me think about futures instead of just getting through each day." Martha's heart was pounding. "Thomas, I care about you, Martha," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I know it has not been long, and I know I have no right to speak when I am just a cowboy with no real prospects beyond my wages. But I needed you to know. I care about you and about your mother and this place you have built from nothing but hard work and determination." Martha felt tears prick her eyes. "I care about you too," she whispered, "but I am afraid. I have been alone, responsible for Mama for so long. I do not know how to be anything else." Thomas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and took her hand in his. His palm was calloused from years of ranch work, rough against her own work-worn hand. "You do not have to be alone," he said gently. "Not if you do not want to be." "What are you saying?" Martha asked, though her heart already knew. "I am saying that I want to court you properly, if you will have me. I am saying that I want to be here, not just as a boarder but as someone who cares about what happens to you and your mother. I know I should wait longer, be more patient, but life out here has taught me that tomorrow is not promised. When you find something worth holding on to, you do not let it slip away." Martha looked at their joined hands, then up at his face, seeing the hope and fear warring in his expression. She thought about the past weeks, about how much lighter her burden had felt with him helping, about how her mother smiled more now, about how she caught herself listening for his horse when he had been away, about how right this felt. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, you may court me." The kiss he pressed to her forehead was gentle and reverent, a promise more than a demand. Martha closed her eyes and let herself feel the moment, let herself believe that perhaps happiness was not just for other people. Catherine was unsurprised by their announcement the next morning and gave her blessing with a knowing smile. "About time you two figured out what I have known for weeks," she said, though her eyes were warm with approval. The next few months passed in a blur of work and quiet happiness. Thomas continued his work with the Diamond Ranch, but arranged his schedule so that he spent more time in Placitas. When he was away, Martha found herself missing him with an intensity that both surprised and pleased her. When he returned, often with small gifts, a ribbon for her hair, a book for Catherine, fresh beef from the ranch, her heart would soar. They were careful in their courtship, mindful of propriety and Catherine's presence, but the connection between them deepened with each passing day. Thomas taught Martha to ride one of the ranch horses he borrowed, taking her out into the desert to see the sunsets she had always admired, but never had time to properly appreciate. Martha introduced Thomas to the simple pleasures of a well-kept home, teaching him her mother's recipe for apple pie and laughing at his attempts to help with the more delicate laundry items. It was in October, when the desert heat had finally broken and the air held a hint of coolness, that Thomas asked Martha to marry him. They were alone in the house, Catherine having gone to visit a friend in town, and he had been unusually nervous all morning. "Martha Zimmerman," he said, taking both her hands in his and dropping to one knee in the middle of their small kitchen, "you have made me happier than I ever thought possible. You are strong and kind and beautiful, and I wake up every day grateful that I stumbled onto your doorstep. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The ring he produced was simple, a gold band with a small stone that caught the light, and Martha learned later that he had spent 2 months' wages on it. But in that moment, she barely saw the ring. All she saw was the man she loved looking up at her with his heart in his eyes. "Yes," she said, pulling him to his feet. "Yes, Thomas Bailey, I will marry you." Their kiss was not chaste or careful. It was full of the passion and promise they had been holding back for months, and when they finally broke apart, both were breathless and laughing. Catherine cried happy tears when they told her, and immediately began planning the wedding, despite Martha's protests that something simple would be fine. "Nonsense," Catherine declared. "You are my only daughter, and you will have a proper wedding, even if it is a modest one." They were married 6 weeks later in the small Catholic church in Placitas, with Catherine and several of Thomas's friends from the Diamond Ranch in attendance. Martha wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried wildflowers that Thomas had ridden out to pick at dawn. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, and when the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Martha felt as though her heart might burst from happiness. Thomas had saved his money and rented a small house on the edge of town, closer to the main road and with more room than Martha's childhood home. They moved Catherine in with them, setting her up in the best bedroom with southern exposure for warmth and light. Martha continued taking in laundry, though less now that Thomas's income supplemented their household, and Catherine helped with the lighter tasks on her good days. Marriage suited Martha. Thomas was an attentive and loving husband, treating her with respect and tenderness. He never complained about the long hours she worked or the fact that her mother lived with them. Instead, he pitched in wherever he could, making their small house a true home. The first time Martha realized she might be pregnant, she was terrified and elated in equal measure. She waited until she was sure, until Dr. Harrison confirmed her suspicions, before telling Thomas. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for, pure joy and excitement tempered with concern for her well-being. "We are going to have a baby," he kept repeating, as if he could not quite believe it. "Martha, we are going to be parents." Catherine was equally thrilled, already planning and knitting despite Martha's protestations that it was too early. "Nonsense," her mother said, her fingers working the needles with practiced ease. "I am going to be a grandmother, and I intend to spoil this child properly." The pregnancy was not easy. Martha suffered from terrible sickness in the first months, and as she grew larger, the work became more difficult. Thomas hired a young woman from town to help with the laundry, insisting that Martha needed to rest. Martha protested but secretly was grateful. The heat of the summer was oppressive, and she found herself tiring easily. It was in late August of 1879, just over a year after Thomas had first come into their lives, that Martha went into labor. The birth was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Thomas paced the porch, unable to stay still, while Dr. Harrison and Catherine attended to Martha. When the baby's cry finally split the air, Thomas nearly broke down the door getting inside. Martha lay exhausted in their bed, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, but her smile was radiant as she held their son. "A boy," she said softly as Thomas approached. "We have a son, Thomas." Thomas sat carefully on the edge of the bed, his eyes fixed on the tiny red face peeking out from the blanket. "He is perfect," he whispered. "You are perfect. Thank you, Martha." They named him James after Martha's father, and he became the center of their universe. Thomas proved to be a devoted father, taking to the role with the same dedication he brought to everything else. He would walk the floor with James at night when the baby was fussy, giving Martha a chance to sleep. He would sing silly songs that made Martha laugh and the baby gurgle with what might have been approval. Catherine flourished in her role as grandmother, though her health continued its slow decline. She spent hours with James, telling him stories and singing him the songs she had once sung to Martha. On her good days, she was vibrant and engaged. On her bad days, she apologized for being a burden, though neither Martha nor Thomas would hear of it. "You are not a burden, Mama," Martha would say firmly. "You took care of me my whole life. Let us take care of you now." As James grew from infant to toddler, the Bailey household settled into a comfortable rhythm. Thomas had been promoted to foreman at the Diamond Ranch, which meant better pay and more responsibility, but also less time away from home. Martha had stopped taking in laundry entirely when she became pregnant again, this time with twins who arrived in the spring of 1881. The girls, whom they named Emma and Grace, completed their family in a way Martha had not known was missing. Thomas now had 3 children to dote on, and he took his role seriously, teaching James to ride and helping Martha manage the chaos of 2 infants while caring for Catherine. It was in the fall of 1881 that Catherine's health took a serious turn. The cough that had plagued her for years worsened, and she grew weak despite Dr. Harrison's best efforts. Martha knew, with a heavy heart, that her mother was dying. Catherine faced her decline with grace and acceptance. "I have lived a good life," she told Martha one afternoon as they sat together in the autumn sunshine, watching Thomas play with the children in the yard. "I have seen my daughter happy and loved, met my grandchildren. That is more than many people get." "I am not ready to lose you, Mama," Martha whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You will never lose me, darling," Catherine said, reaching out to clasp Martha's hand. "I will always be with you in your heart and in your children, and you have Thomas now. He is a good man, Martha. Your father would have been so pleased." Catherine passed peacefully in her sleep 2 weeks later, with Martha and Thomas at her bedside. The grief was profound, but Martha found solace in her mother's final words and in the family that surrounded her. Thomas held her through the worst of it, letting her cry against his chest while he whispered words of comfort. The funeral was well attended. Catherine had been respected in the community, and many former students came to pay their respects. As they lowered her mother's coffin into the ground beside Martha's father, Martha felt Thomas's arm solid around her waist, anchoring her. In the weeks that followed, the house felt emptier despite the noise and activity of 3 small children. Martha found herself turning to speak to her mother, only to remember she was gone. But slowly, the sharp edges of grief softened into something more bearable. She could think of her mother with smiles along with the tears, remembering her wisdom and humor and love. Life moved forward as it always does. James grew tall and strong, showing an early aptitude for ranch work that made Thomas proud. The twins were mischievous and bright, keeping Martha on her toes. In 1883, Martha gave birth to another daughter, Sarah. And in 1885, a final son they named Thomas Jr. came along, giving them 5 children in total. The house Thomas had rented they eventually bought, making improvements over the years as his salary increased, and they saved carefully. Martha occasionally returned to painting, finding time in the early mornings before the children woke or late at night after they had been put to bed. Her paintings, mostly of the desert landscapes she loved, decorated their walls and brought her joy. Thomas proved to be everything Martha had sensed in him that first day when he had collapsed against their doorframe, bleeding and desperate. He was steady and strong, loving and patient. He treated Martha as an equal partner in their life together, valuing her opinion and supporting her dreams even while building their family. In 1890, 12 years after they had first met, Martha and Thomas sat on their porch in the evening, watching their children play in the yard. James was nearly 11 now, already talking about working at the ranch with his father. The twins were 9, constantly plotting their next adventure. Sarah was a thoughtful 7, and little Thomas Jr., now 5, was trying to keep up with his older siblings. "You ever think about that day?" Martha asked, leaning against Thomas's shoulder, "when you showed up bleeding and half dead at our door?" Thomas wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Every day," he said softly. "Best bullet I ever took," Martha laughed, elbowing him gently. "That is a terrible thing to say." "But true," Thomas insisted. "That bullet led me to you, to this life, to our children. I would take a dozen more for that." "Well, please do not," Martha said firmly. "I prefer you alive and whole." "Yes, madam," Thomas replied with a grin, pressing a kiss to her temple. "How about this instead? I am grateful every day that I stumbled into your life. You saved me, Martha, in more ways than just patching up a gunshot wound. You gave me a home, a family, a reason to be better than I was." "We saved each other," Martha corrected softly. "I was drowning in responsibility and fear, barely keeping my head above water. You gave me hope and help and love. You showed me that I did not have to do everything alone." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the desert sky in shades of orange and pink. The children's laughter filled the air, a sound that never failed to make Martha's heart full. "Mama would have loved this," Martha said suddenly. "Seeing all of this, the children, our life together." "She knew," Thomas said with certainty. "She told me once, near the end, that she was not worried about leaving you because she knew I would take care of you. I promised her I would, and I meant it." Martha felt tears prick her eyes, but they were not sad tears. "She was right to trust you. You have taken such good care of us." "It is not a burden," Thomas said firmly. "It is my joy and my privilege. You and our children are my whole world, Martha Bailey." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Martha reflected on the journey that had brought them here. It had started with laundry and desperation, with a wounded cowboy and a woman struggling to survive. It had grown into something beautiful and lasting, a love built on mutual respect and genuine affection. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and challenges as all years do. Thomas was eventually made partner in the Diamond Ranch, a reward for his years of dedicated service and his skill with both horses and men. The additional income allowed them to make more improvements to their home and to set aside money for their children's futures. James, as expected, went to work at the ranch alongside his father when he turned 14. The bond between father and son was strong, and Thomas took pride in teaching his eldest everything he knew about ranching and horses, and the hard, honest work that defined their lives. The twins, as they grew into young women, showed no interest in traditional feminine pursuits beyond what was necessary. Emma wanted to be a teacher like her grandmother had been, spending hours with the books Catherine had left behind. Grace, meanwhile, showed a talent for numbers and talked about keeping books for businesses. Martha encouraged both of them, remembering her own lost dreams and determined that her daughters would have opportunities she had not. Sarah was artistic like her mother, and Martha spent many happy hours teaching her daughter to paint. Little Thomas Jr., not so little anymore, was determined to be a lawman when he grew up, much to Thomas Sr.'s mixed feelings about the dangerous profession. In 1895, when Martha was 40 and Thomas was 43, they sat together at James's wedding. Their son, now 21, was marrying a sweet girl from town named Elizabeth, and the joy on his face as he said his vows reminded Martha powerfully of her own wedding day. "We are getting old," Martha whispered to Thomas as they watched the young couple dance. "Speak for yourself," Thomas replied with a grin. "I am in my prime." Martha laughed, the sound drawing smiles from those nearby. After 17 years of marriage, they were still best friends as well as lovers, still able to make each other laugh even as gray crept into their hair and lines appeared on their faces. The twins married within a year of each other. Emma to a newspaper editor from Santa Fe who supported her dream of teaching, and Grace to a banker in Albuquerque who was impressed by her head for numbers. Both daughters remained close, visiting frequently and writing long letters when they could not come in person. Sarah, true to her artistic nature, moved to Denver at 19 to study painting seriously, though she returned to Placitas often, her heart never quite leaving the desert landscapes she loved. Thomas Jr., stubbornly pursuing his dream despite his parents' concerns, became a deputy sheriff in Placitas at 20, working to keep the town safe as New Mexico moved toward eventual statehood. As Martha and Thomas grew older, they found themselves with more time for each other. The children were launched into their own lives, and while they missed the chaos of a full house, there was something sweet about returning to just the two of them. They would take long rides into the desert, just as they had during their courtship, though they moved slower now and took more breaks. They would sit on their porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching the stars, talking about everything and nothing. They would wake up together each morning, grateful for another day side by side. In 1898, Martha became a grandmother for the first time when James and Elizabeth had a son. Holding her grandson, seeing her own son as a father, Martha was overwhelmed with emotion. She thought of her mother, of how Catherine had so looked forward to being a grandmother, and wished desperately that she could have lived to see this moment. "She knows," Thomas said softly, reading her mind as he so often could. "Wherever she is, she knows, and she is happy." More grandchildren followed as the years progressed. Emma had 3 children in quick succession. Grace had 2. Sarah eventually married a fellow artist and had 1 daughter, and Thomas Jr. remained stubbornly single, claiming he was married to his job. The turn of the century found Martha and Thomas in their late 40s, still healthy and active, surrounded by children and grandchildren who visited often. Their little house was frequently filled with noise and laughter, with children's toys scattered across the floor and the smell of Martha's cooking filling the air. On their 20th wedding anniversary in December of 1899, Thomas surprised Martha with a painting easel and enough supplies to last her a year. "You gave up so much to take care of your mother and then our children," he said, as she stared at the gifts in wonder. "Now it is your turn. Paint, Martha. Fill this house with your art." Martha threw her arms around his neck, holding him tight. "How did I get so lucky?" she whispered. "I ask myself the same question every day," Thomas replied, kissing her soundly. In 1901, Thomas Jr. finally married, falling hard for a young woman named Catherine, named after Martha's mother, which felt like a beautiful full-circle moment. The wedding was large and joyous, with all of the Bailey children and grandchildren in attendance. As Martha watched her youngest son dance with his bride, Thomas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "We did good," he said simply. "We did," Martha agreed, leaning back against him. "We really did." The years of their middle age were peaceful and productive. Martha's paintings began to sell, first locally and then to buyers from Santa Fe and Albuquerque, who admired her stark, honest depictions of the New Mexico landscape. The money was nice, but more than that, Martha loved the validation that her art mattered, that the dreams she had set aside for so many years had value. Thomas continued working at the Diamond Ranch until he was 55, when he finally agreed to retire and let younger men do the hard physical labor. He took on a consulting role, advising on purchases and training, but spent most of his days at home with Martha, helping her stretch canvases and mix paints, content to be her assistant after so many years of her supporting him. They grew old together gracefully, their love deepening with each passing year. The passion of their youth mellowed into something even more profound, a partnership built on decades of shared joys and sorrows, of raising children and building a life, of choosing each other every day. In 1910, at 65 and 58 respectively, they celebrated their 31st wedding anniversary surrounded by their 5 children, numerous grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The house they had bought and expanded over the years was bursting at the seams, filled with the family they had built together. James stood up during dinner to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass. "You showed us what love looks like, what commitment and partnership and respect look like. You built a family on a foundation of hard work and genuine affection, and every one of us has benefited from your example. We love you both." The chorus of agreement brought tears to Martha's eyes. She looked around the table at the faces of her children and their children, at the life she and Thomas had created from almost nothing, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. That night, after everyone had left and they were alone again, Martha and Thomas sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. The desert night was cool and clear, the stars bright overhead. "You remember what you said to me that first night on this porch?" Martha asked softly. "About how I made you think about futures instead of just getting through each day." "I do," Thomas replied, his hand finding hers automatically. "You gave me the same thing," Martha said. "Before you came, I was just surviving, just trying to make it through each day with my mother fed and the bills paid. I had forgotten how to dream. You reminded me. You gave me a future I never imagined possible." Thomas brought her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "We gave each other a future." "That is what love does, Martha. It opens up possibilities. It makes you brave enough to dream." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had spent more than 3 decades building a life together, who had weathered storms and celebrated triumphs, who had chosen each other every single day and never regretted it. "I would do it all again," Martha said suddenly. "Every hard moment, every struggle, every tear. I would do it all again if it meant ending up here with you." "So would I," Thomas agreed softly. Taking that bullet, stumbling to your door, that was the best accident of my life. You were the best accident of my life." "Not an accident," Martha corrected, squeezing his hand. "Fate. It had to be fate that brought you to me." "Fate, luck, divine intervention, I do not care what we call it," Thomas said with a smile in his voice. "I am just grateful it happened." As they sat together under the New Mexico stars, Martha reflected on the incredible journey of her life. She had started as a woman alone, taking in laundry to support her aging mother with no prospects and fading dreams. A wounded cowboy had collapsed on her doorstep, and everything had changed. Thomas had not just hired her for laundry, he had become her partner in every sense of the word. He had cared for her and her mother, had helped shoulder burdens that had been crushing her, had given her love and support, and a family beyond her wildest dreams. In the years that followed, Martha and Thomas continued to enjoy their twilight years together. They traveled a bit, taking the train to see their children and grandchildren who had spread across New Mexico and beyond. They tended their garden, took slow walks through town, and spent long afternoons on their porch, simply enjoying each other's presence. Martha continued to paint until her hands grew too stiff with arthritis to hold a brush steadily. Even then, she would sit and direct Thomas, who gamely tried to follow her instructions, creating paintings that were objectively terrible but made them both laugh until they cried. Thomas's health remained relatively robust until he was nearly 70, when his heart began to show signs of weakness. Dr. Harrison, now ancient himself, prescribed rest and limited activity. Thomas grumbled about being treated like an invalid, but secretly enjoyed having an excuse to sit and read while Martha painted nearby. They grew frailer together, moving slower, needing more help from their children, but their love never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger, refined by time into something pure and unshakable. On a cool evening in the spring of 1915, 37 years after they had first met, Martha and Thomas sat on their porch watching the sunset. Thomas's health had been declining more rapidly recently, and they both knew, without saying it aloud, that their time together was drawing to a close. "I am not afraid," Thomas said suddenly, breaking the companionable silence. "Of what comes next, I mean. I have lived a full life, Martha. A happy life. I have loved and been loved. I have children who make me proud and grandchildren who light up my days. I have spent nearly 4 decades with the woman I love. What more could a man ask for?" Martha's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I am afraid," she admitted, "of being without you. I do not remember how to be alone anymore." "You will not be alone," Thomas said firmly, reaching for her hand. "You will have our children and grandchildren. You will have your art and your friends. And you will have our memories, Martha. 37 years of memories." "That is not nothing. It is everything," Martha whispered. Thomas passed peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks later with Martha beside him. She held his hand as his breathing slowed and stopped, and even through her grief, she felt grateful that he had not suffered, that he had gone gently into whatever came next. The funeral was enormous, a testament to the lives they had touched. All 5 children came with their families, and the church was packed with friends, former co-workers from the ranch, people whose lives had been bettered by Thomas's quiet kindness and integrity. As they lowered his coffin into the ground, Martha thought about that day 37 years ago when a bleeding cowboy had stumbled to her door. She thought about how one moment, one choice to help a stranger, had transformed her entire life. "Thank you," she whispered, her hand pressed against her heart. "Thank you for everything." Martha lived for 5 more years after Thomas's death. They were not lonely years, despite her missing him every single day. Her children visited frequently, and she spent long hours with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather and the love that had built their family. She painted some of her best work in those years, channeling her grief and love into art that captured the beauty and harshness of the New Mexico landscape. Her paintings sold well, and she donated most of the money to help young women in situations similar to what hers had been, alone, struggling, needing just a little help to survive. In the spring of 1920, at the age of 75, Martha fell ill. Her children gathered around her bed, just as she had once gathered around her mother's, and she faced death with the same grace and acceptance Catherine had shown. "I have had a wonderful life," she told her children in one of her final conversations. "I have been blessed beyond measure. And I will see your father again soon. That thought brings me more comfort than you can imagine." She passed on a clear spring morning, with sunlight streaming through her window and her children surrounding her bed. Her final words were a whispered, "Thomas," and her face held a smile. They buried her beside Thomas, their headstones side by side just as they had spent their lives. The service was attended by 4 generations of Baileys, all of them there, because a woman who took in laundry had opened her door to a wounded cowboy, and both of them had been brave enough to recognize love when it found them. The story of Martha and Thomas Bailey became family legend, passed down through generations. Their great-great-grandchildren would hear about the woman who worked herself to exhaustion to care for her mother, and the cowboy who helped shoulder her burden and won her heart. They would hear about love built on respect and partnership, about facing life's challenges together, about choosing each other every day for nearly 4 decades. The house they had shared was eventually sold, but one of their great-grandsons bought it years later and restored it, keeping it in the family. Martha's paintings hung on the walls, her vibrant depictions of the New Mexico landscape serving as a reminder of the dreams she had set aside and then reclaimed. In the end, what Martha and Thomas had built together was more than just a family, though that would have been legacy enough. They had built a testament to the transforming power of love, to the beauty of 2 people choosing to walk through life side by side, supporting and cherishing each other through all the joys and sorrows that came their way. Their love story, which had begun with laundry and a gunshot wound, had blossomed into something extraordinary, not because it was dramatic or unusual, but because it was real and lasting and true. They had found each other when both needed it most, and they had built a life of meaning and purpose together. And in Placitas, New Mexico, in the house where it all began, their story lived on, a reminder that sometimes the most profound love stories start with the simplest acts of kindness, and that taking a chance on a stranger might just be the best decision you ever make.